Hi, my name is Beatrice, and perhaps I should start by confessing. I was born into a family many would call well off and even privileged. My father inherited an investment company from his father, which he cherished and nurtured, considering his life's work, the sacred continuation of the family tradition, the pride of the family, which he spoke of with that special intonation that made even the air in the room grow heavy. From early childhood, he repeated that one day he would pass this business on to us, his children, and his voice always carried an unshakable confidence, as if it weren't a promise, but a sentence. I have an older sister, Gina, only 3 years older, but from the very beginning, as soon as I learned to notice the differences in the way our parents looked at us, the way they praised us, the way they criticized us, it became perfectly clear. She was the family favorite, the golden girl, the paragon of perfection, who was forgiven and got away with much, while I remained close by, as if in the shadow of her radiance, invisible and a little superfluous. When Gina graduated from college, my father hardly hesitated. He immediately put her at the helm of the company, appointing her CEO. This didn't surprise me, because long before, I knew she would always get the best, without a fight, as if it were her birthright. A few years later, my time came. I graduated from university, returned home, and joined the family business, not as an heir, but simply as a manager, an ordinary employee among dozens of others. I didn't complain, though I always harbored a lingering hope. Maybe if I worked hard, if I put my heart and soul into it, my father would one day see me not just as his youngest daughter, but as a partner he could rely on. I worked hard, so hard that sometimes I even surprised myself at how much energy I had. I spent days compiling endless reports, meeting with clients, honing every figure, every formulation, and finally, after a year of this, I mustered the courage to ask my father about a promotion. I walked into his office, my heart pounding, and when I finally made my request, he didn't even look up from his papers, only saying dryly, "You need to work harder, Beatrice, prove you deserve more." I tried to protest that I already toiled for weeks on end, 60 hours without a break, but he merely shook his head, and I swallowed my resentment and sighed, "Fine, I'll work even harder." A few months later, we were gathered for a family strategy session at the office, and I saw it as a chance to finally have my voice heard. We sat around a large table, my father listening to everyone, and when it was my turn, I felt my palms sweat. But the words flowed. I suggested investing part of our capital in cryptocurrency, specifically Bitcoin, which was just starting to appear in the news, seemed new and unfamiliar, but I believed in the reliability of the technology and its future. The reaction was immediate. Gina burst out laughing, loud and hurt, and said, "Are you serious? This is a scam, Beatrice, we'll lose all our money." I tried to explain that yes, it was a risk, but a calculated one, that it was impossible to forever follow the same path and remain competitive, and that innovation is what allows companies to survive. But my father, leaning back in his chair, looked at me as if I'd offered to trade shares for fairy beans, and quietly said, "You're a dreamer, come back to reality. Our clients need stability, not your wild experiments." "But Dad," Gina interrupted, "this isn't just a mistake, it's a disgrace. She needs to be fired. She's not cut out for business." I felt my face flush and blurted out, "Gina, this is unfair. I want to help us grow." But my father merely nodded and said, "She's right, you're failing, you're fired. I'll give you severance if you leave immediately." I couldn't believe my ears, and Gina added with a cold smile, "And don't give her a bonus. She hasn't done anything useful for the company." I glanced at my mother, who sat silently at the end of the table, hoping she would, as always, act as peacemaker and stand up for me, but she merely nodded slightly, looking at the floor. "It's probably for the best, dear." At that moment, I felt the ground shift beneath my feet. My own father was firing me, and no one, absolutely no one in my family, was raising a voice for me. I stood up, fighting back tears, and said, "Okay, I'll leave." My father wrote me a check for $100,000, a generous sum by most standards, but to me, it seemed like payment for his silence, for me to disappear quietly and never be heard again. I packed my apartment, said goodbye to the few friends I had in town, and moved to another state, to a place where my last name wasn't on every corner, where I didn't have to face the daily stares of people comparing me to Gina. In my new city, I found a job at another investment firm, though not as prestigious as my father's, but they immediately noticed my work ethic and respected my dedication. I bought a small apartment with a mortgage, using part of my allowance for a down payment, and invested the rest in exactly what my father had so vehemently discouraged me from doing: cryptocurrency, Bitcoin. Which at the time still seemed like a crazy idea to many. My family thought I was stupid and reckless, and perhaps I did seem that way to them, but I trusted my own research and my intuition. I believed this technology would change the world. The first year after moving was uneventful. The exchange rate would rise and fall, and I, almost in disbelief at my luck, still quietly held on to my investments and simultaneously poured my energy into my work. Because I understood that the opportunity one had gained from my own mistakes and persistence couldn't be squandered on idle waiting. These efforts soon paid off. With a promotion to senior analyst, when I finally felt like I had carved out a new space of professional autonomy around myself, but a few years later, everything changed. The value of Bitcoin skyrocketed, and the $100,000 I had invested from my severance package began to multiply so quickly that I could barely keep track of the balance on the screen. First 100,000 turned into $1 million, then 10 million, then 50, and when, shuddering from the unreality of what was happening, I cashed out some of my assets. My account ended up with $250 million. I sat in my small apartment and stared at the numbers for a long time, trying to wrap my head around the idea that, with the hush money my father had given me, I had created a fortune that eclipsed anything that had once been considered a family platitude or achievement. I put aside any unnecessary pride, setting aside a significant portion of my funds for safety and future investments, and invested the rest in what I had dreamed of since I was kicked out of the house. I founded my own investment company, not according to my father's model, not based on the cult of caution and repetition year after year, but on wise, calculated risk, investing in promising startups, neural networks, and artificial intelligence technologies even before they were recognized as mainstream, backing teams that traditional investors avoided, and betting on people, not on a facade. I didn't use my real name. I wanted my work to be independent, to be judged by its results, not by family baggage, so I named the company after my dog, whose official name was long and a bit paradoxical, but whom I affectionately called Mr. Downtown, and Downtown Capital Investment was born. Over the next 7 years, I built the company with all my might, betting on what others ignored, and it paid off many times over. Several startups we believed in became global sensations. Our investments in AI returned us 100-fold. We were written about in magazines, we were featured in Forbes lists, and yet I never once contacted my family, not for holidays or birthdays, because they made it clear there was no place for me in their world, and I, forced but free, built my own. 12 years after leaving, I was sitting in a corner office overlooking the city when my assistant knocked on the door and quietly said, "Ms. Beatrice, you might be interested in hearing about your father's company." Although I hadn't followed their affairs for years, curiosity gripped me so tightly that I picked up the folder he'd left behind and found a financial report. The older generation's company was on the verge of bankruptcy and actively seeking buyers. It wasn't so much a triumphant sense of satisfaction that overwhelmed me as a curiosity. What had gone wrong? I called my lawyer into the office and said clearly, "Ask our lawyers to look into this. I need a full financial analysis of this company." A week later, I was sitting over a thick file and seeing a grim picture: 3 years of losses in a row. My father still clung to conservative strategies, refusing to adapt to the market, while competitors entered cryptocurrency and venture capital, and he stubbornly held on to a portfolio of bonds and safe stocks. Gina was technically still CEO, but her activity was superficial. Her feeds were filled with photos from resorts, yachts, and boutiques. She seemed to spend more time at parties than in her office, and the company, once the pride of the family, was dying. I gathered my courage, called my lawyer, and said calmly but decisively, "I want to buy this company, start negotiations." He looked at me as if I were crazy. "Ms. Beatrice, with all due respect, this is not particularly valuable. and I replied, trying to hide the tremor in my voice. It's not about profit, it's personal. He nodded silently and then said, okay, I'll begin the process. 2 days later he returned with figures, and I remember his face, usually calm and orderly, darkening slightly as he tossed a folder of printouts onto the table. The company as it stands is probably worth a maximum of $5 million, and given the losses and high debt load, we could probably negotiate the price down to $3.5 million, he said quietly, as if reciting a recipe for a far from festive dish, and for a moment there was silence in the room, because hearing about someone's impending loss is always strange when you hold the fate of that loss in your hands. I looked at the figures and at his face and answered without the usual polite, bargaining caution that was so often heard in conference rooms, pay them the full $5 million, don't haggle, and added, before he could say anything else, because I knew the value not only of the figures but of my own decision, no negotiation, offer the maximum price. Over the next month, my legal team and financial experts worked through every detail, every contract line was cleared, every potential pitfall was firmly blocked, and we scheduled the contract signing for early January, just after the new year, because business cycles love clarity and because I wanted the transition to happen without unnecessary drama and with minimal fuss. Christmas was approaching, and, unusually and almost shockingly for me, I decided to visit my family, for the first time in 10 years, succumbing to the desire to see their faces, to see how they would react when they realized who had bought their company. I wasn't invited, of course, they probably didn't even know how to contact me, but I longed for this moment. I wanted to walk through the door that had once always been opened for me, and see which of them would see me with surprise, and which with bitterness. I flew to my hometown on Christmas Eve and checked into a nice hotel, because even if everything was planned internally, the external appearance of the event had to be perfect. The next morning, I drove to my parents' estate, that huge house where I grew up, where every piece of furniture knew our voices. I rang the doorbell and waited, and when my mother opened the door, she literally froze, her jaw dropped, and she whispered, "Beatrice, is it really you?" "Hi, Mom, Merry Christmas," I replied, and, walking into the familiar lobby, I saw almost the same interior, the same expensive chairs, the same paintings, only the air seemed thicker with foreign signs of success, and the only thing that had truly changed in this picture was the presence of Gina and her husband, a man I had never seen at our family table before. Gina stood up from the dining room table where everyone was having breakfast, and her voice rang out sharply, "What are you doing here? Why did you show up? Couldn't you have stayed home today?" "I came to see my family for Christmas." "Is that forbidden?" I said calmly, but with the inner steel I'd built up over the years. She snorted and, looking at my father, added sarcastically, "You probably heard that Dad sold the company," and, without waiting for an answer, continued, "Let me guess, you came to ask for a cut of the money? Well, you're not getting a cent from us." My father stood up at that moment, puffing out his chest like a man accustomed to applause for his decisions, and declared, "That's right, I'm going to close the deal in a few days. It's going to be a very profitable sale," and his voice carried what had previously seemed to me like safe pride. "Really? What's the buyer's name?" I asked, and what followed was short, like a click. "Downtown Capital Investment," Gina replied smugly. "Not that the name means anything to you." I couldn't help but laugh softly, not maliciously, but with that mixture of tired irony that women my age, accustomed to the insincere expectations of their families, were accustomed to, and said, "Downtown Capital Investment is my company. I'm its founder and CEO." The room fell so silent you could have heard a pin drop, and only after a long moment did Gina press her lips together and say through her teeth, "That's not funny, stop joking." I pulled a business card from my bag and handed it to my father. My name was embossed in silver letters next to the company logo, and I watched the color drain from his face. "Did you do this out of spite? Are you trying to get revenge on your own family?" His voice wavered, a mixture of anger and incomprehension. "Are you trying to humiliate me?" I answered evenly, because behind that evenness lay the long-awaited truth. "The truth is, I'm trying to buy a money-losing company at a fair price, Father, and I'm not looking for humiliation, I'm looking for a responsible owner for the legacy you've so carefully guarded, but which is now destroying you." He stood up abruptly, and Gina, unable to contain her horror, cried out, "I'm canceling the deal. I'm not selling you anything now," and rushed to her bag, snatched up a whole stack of documents, and threw them on the table, shouting, "The deal was made weeks ago. We signed a preliminary agreement. If you back out now, there will be severe financial penalties." My father, looking like a man crushed by the news of his own vulnerability, shouted, "You're trying to deceive your own father. I won't sell my company that cheap." And there was a pain in his voice that I had once been instructed to ignore. I simply said in a calm, almost academic tone, "Dad, the real value of your business is $3.5 million. I'm paying $5 million only because it's a family company, and I'm giving you more than it's worth so you can get out of this situation without shame." Gina groaned, "That's impossible. You don't have that kind of money. This is some kind of scam." I looked at her with a slight smile that held no malice. "I have plenty of money. My company's assets are valued at $250 million. I could buy 10 companies like yours." And it was true, but I said it not to boast, but to brush aside the complaints that their every smile had thrown at me in recent years. Her husband, who had remained silent until then, gaped in surprise, while my mother turned pale, and my father sank heavily into his chair, clearly feeling his familiar world crumbling. I looked at them softly and, without raising my voice, said, "You still have a few days to think about it," then added, as I was leaving, "But remember the penalties for refusing to sign a signed agreement and how it will affect your reputation in the business community." Unwilling to listen to further reproaches and pleas, I turned and walked away, leaving them in a stunned silence that, it seemed to me, was far louder than any shouting. Over the next few days, my phone was literally inundated with messages. My parents begged me to talk, my father called, but most of their communiques and requests came from Gina, at first, laughing and brazen, then almost pleading, "What if instead of selling, you just invest $5 million in a 40% stake?" she suggested in one message, as if the bargaining she always did could solve everything. I replied briefly and precisely, because in deals, as in life, clarity is better than subterfuge. "I'm not interested, I'm only buying the entire company." The day of the contract signing arrived, and I watched as my father, sitting at the long conference table, seemed to struggle with himself with every movement of his hand, his face expressing deep dissatisfaction, as if every word on the document burned his eyes, and every signature cut his pride. He wrote his name slowly, as if he wanted to leave a mark on the paper deeper than the ink, and at that moment, Gina stood next to him, her gaze fixed on me with a mixture of anger, contempt, and a strange pleading. When the last signature was completed, she stepped toward me and, in a slightly trembling but still defiant voice, said, "I would like to remain with the company, in my current position." I met her gaze calmly and said, like someone accustomed to the rules of business etiquette but understanding that more than just a job was at stake, "There's a board meeting tomorrow, and we'll discuss your employment status." The next day, I walked into the boardroom of what was now officially my company, smelling the old leather chairs and papers that had absorbed decades of decisions made by the people now seated before me, all of them longtime colleagues of my father, and I saw their eyes dart between him and me, as if they weren't quite sure who was in charge. Gina sat at the far end of the table, her back straight and trying to look confident, though her fingers fiddled nervously with her pen, and my parents were there, watching with obvious tension, as if hoping for a miracle. I asked my assistant to set up the projector, and the white screen flashed with the presentation I'd put together the night before, sitting late in my hotel room, carefully selecting every number. "Good morning, everyone," I began confidently. "As the new owner of this company, I've conducted a thorough review of our operations, and today I'd like to discuss the performance of our current CEO." I pressed a button, and the first slide changed to a new title. "This chart shows travel expenses over the past 3 years." Tension filled the room. "Gina, your travel expenses have increased by 40% each year," I said, and heard her hasty retort, "I had business meetings." I nodded and continued, "These expenses include first-class flights to Paris, Monaco, and the Caribbean, as well as stays at 5-star resorts. I switched slides. And this expense line includes your company-funded vacation wardrobe, designer clothes, shoes, bags. Gina's face flushed, and she muttered under her breath, those were business expenses." I pressed the button again, and a table lit up the screen. "Cosmetologist services, spa treatments, personal shoppers, you ran all of this through the company as a professional development program," I said firmly. "Gina, your personal expenses recorded on this company's balance sheet total hundreds of thousands of dollars." The board members looked at the numbers with shocked expressions, and I noticed that many were seeing such a detailed breakdown for the first time. I continued confidently, "I move that Gina be fired immediately as CEO." One of the board members asked, "Are you all in favor?" And hands went up one after another, not a single one remaining. Even my parents hesitated to vote against. Gina jumped up so abruptly that her chair toppled over and screamed, "This is a setup. You're setting this all up to humiliate me." I replied calmly, "I plan to conduct a performance review of all executives. The numbers speak for themselves." She screamed, "I hate you. You're doing this out of jealousy," and slammed the door, running out of the room. My parents stood up to follow her, but my father paused for a moment and glared at me. "You deliberately embarrassed your sister in front of everyone. You wanted revenge." I met his gaze coldly. "She got what she deserved. She embezzled company funds for her own personal use, and that's called fraud." They left without another word. Over the next few weeks, I completely rebuilt the company, hired my own management team, updated our investment strategies, converted the venture into a subsidiary of Downtown Capital Investment, and, to my satisfaction, within 3 months we were back in the black, proving to everyone that change was necessary. My parents continued to try to reach me, messages, calls, even handwritten letters. I ignored most of them, but eventually agreed to meet them for coffee. They looked older than I remembered, and my father especially haggard, with dull, tired eyes. "We need to talk about money," he began as soon as we sat down, his voice sounding like it was a painful confession. "We gave half of what you paid us, Gina. We thought it was fair. After all, she worked for the company all these years." I remained silent, pretending to simply enjoy my coffee, but my father continued, "Okay, but there's a problem. Gina's husband has a gambling problem. He lost most of their share paying off debts. Gina spent almost everything else covering his losses at the casino and bookmakers." I took a sip and remained silent, though inside I was seething. My father sighed heavily and added, "And I still have debts of my own, business loans I took out to keep the company afloat. We had to spend most of the remaining money paying them off." I looked at him straight and said coldly, "So, you're broke?" Mom quickly interjected, "We still have money, but it's not enough to support our lifestyle. We can't afford to keep the house. We'll have to move to a more modest place." I replied calmly, "That sounds like a practical solution." Dad immediately blushed and almost shouted, "Is that all you can say? We're your parents, and you fired me, called me stupid, ridiculed my ideas, and kicked me out of the family business, and now we need your help." My mother gave me a long, slightly guilty look, and I immediately knew this wouldn't be an easy conversation, because her eyes were filled with worry, mingled with a kind of shame I'd never seen in her before. She walked over to the chair across from my desk and sat down, folding her hands in her lap as if trying to keep herself from shaking. Only after a long pause did she say, "We made mistakes, Beatrice, and I want to say it out loud. We apologize." Her voice was quiet, unusually gentle, and I replied evenly, "If you're truly struggling, sell the property and buy a smaller house. Take the rest of the money, and I'll help you invest it wisely. I won't give you the money, but I'll help you invest what you have so you can earn an income and live comfortably in retirement." My father, who had remained silent the entire time, suddenly stood up abruptly, his face flushing again, as if he couldn't bear the fact that this time the advice was coming from me. "We don't need investment advice. We need real help, and you refuse to provide it." I responded coldly and firmly, "I'm offering you exactly what I would offer any client. If that's not enough, then that's your choice." They left in a huff, and I didn't hear from them for several months, though sometimes, returning home in the evening, I caught myself waiting for a call, but it never came. Then one day my lawyer called me. His voice was businesslike, but I detected a hint of surprise. Your parents contacted us about investing $500,000 in your company. I sighed and said, create a standard client account, the same terms as everyone else. He clarified, are you sure? They're your parents, I smiled, though I felt a twinge of bitterness inside. That's precisely why they should be treated like everyone else, no special treatment. So an investment account was opened, and I invested their money in a conservative but reliable portfolio that didn't promise miracles but guaranteed stability. Over the next year, they earned a 15% return, enough to live comfortably in retirement, but nothing extravagant that would send them back to their old habits. From mutual friends, I learned that Gina had finally convinced her husband to go to rehab for his gambling addiction, and they began therapy together, trying to restore both their marriage and their finances. Gina got a permanent job at a marketing firm, not as CEO, as she was used to, but as a regular employee, going to the office every morning and returning home in the evening. Just like I once did, part of me felt a slight pang of regret about how things had turned out, but deep down, I knew she needed to learn to earn and hold her own, not just accept it because her last name opened doors. As for my parents, they eventually sold their mansion, which had once seemed like a fortress to me, inaccessible and eternal, and bought a nice but modest house in a retirement home, where everything was simpler. According to neighbors, they gradually adjusted to the new lifestyle, although I'm sure the loss of their former luxuries was especially difficult for them at first. One evening, about 6 months after they opened an account with my company, my mother called me. Her voice trembled, but there was a sincerity in it I hadn't heard from her in so long. Beatrice, I wanted to thank you for treating us fairly, not for special treatment, but for treating us like anyone else. We don't even deserve that after the way we treated you. I replied briefly, you're welcome, Mom. She sighed. I know we'll never be able to atone for firing you and putting Gina ahead of you all these years, but I want you to know I'm proud of what you've accomplished. You were right about everything, about risk, about cryptocurrency, about innovation. We should have listened to you. It was the closest to a real apology I ever got from my parents, and I said quietly, I appreciate you saying that. My mother hesitated and asked, will you ever come visit us? Not for business, just as a family? I thought about it and answered evasively, I'll think about it, maybe, let me check my schedule. She nodded, and I heard relief in her voice. That's all I can ask for. After the conversation, I sat in my office, looking out the huge window at the cityscape, and thought about how I'd built an empire from the ashes and pain my family had once heaped upon me, how I'd proven wrong everyone who'd called me foolish and reckless. But the victory wasn't what I'd imagined, not triumphant, but rather calm and complete, as if a peace had come over me. I'd taken my revenge, achieving success beyond all expectations. I'd bought my father's company and fired my sister, forcing them to admit I'd been right all along. 2 years had passed since I'd closed that deal. Downtown Capital Investment had grown even larger, and the branch that had once been my father's firm was now one of their most profitable divisions. I'd completely transformed their investment strategy, and we'd achieved profit margins my father couldn't even dream of. I was sitting in my office, reviewing quarterly reports, when my assistant called, your mother is here to see you. She doesn't have an appointment. I paused for a second, hesitating, because our relationship remained polite but distant. We spoke on the phone maybe once a month, and always only about safe topics like the weather or the performance of their portfolio. Still, I said, let her in. My mother walked into my office, looking noticeably nervous. She was dressed casually, a far cry from the designer outfits she once prided herself on, and the first thing she said was quiet and nervous. Hello, thank you for seeing me without warning. I put the papers down and asked, is everything okay? Is Dad okay? He's fine, Mom said, and I felt an invisible weight lift from my shoulders, as her voice lacked the worry I'd feared. In fact, we're both fine, better than we've been in years, thanks to our investments actually starting to generate consistent returns. I nodded, trying to hide my relief, and said, that's a good result, but then what brought you here? She sat down across from my desk, folding her hands neatly, as if she were afraid I'd notice her fingers trembling, and said, I wanted to talk to you about Gina. I felt my shoulders tense, As if my body had suddenly remembered all the pain associated with her name, and I answered dryly, "What about her?" Mom sighed and said, "She and her husband have been in therapy for over a year, he's been sober for 18 months, and Gina works at that marketing firm, and she's doing really well." I was surprised, but my voice remained calm. "I'm glad to hear that," Mom continued, looking at me with a hint of hope. "She wants to talk to you, to apologize properly." I shook my head. "Mom, I don't think that's a good idea," but Mom didn't back down. "I know there's so much pain between you, but she's really changed. Now she understands what it means to work hard for something, not just get everything for nothing." I felt the anger, long buried deep, rise again. She called me stupid, she demanded that Dad fire me, she laughed when my ideas were rejected. Mom paused, then said quietly, "I know, and she knows it too, she understands how wrong she was, we've all been wrong." I looked into her eyes and for the first time saw the genuine regret I'd been waiting for. "Why now?" I asked. "It's been so many years," Mom replied, "because she was finally able to admit what she did, and because life is short, and we've already wasted too much time." I couldn't answer right away. Part of me wanted to close the door forever and never reopen old wounds, but another part was tired of carrying that lingering anger. I said, "I'll think about it." Mom nodded with relief. "That's all I ask." A few weeks later, I agreed to meet Gina for coffee. We chose a neutral location, a quiet cafe somewhere between our cities. When she walked in, I barely recognized her. No ostentatious glitz, no forced self-importance, just simple jeans, a sweater, and eyes that, instead of their usual self-assurance, sparkled with a warm but unsettling sincerity. "Thank you for coming," she said as we sat down at the table. She looked straight at me and said, "I was terrible to you, not only when your father fired you, but long before that. I always felt threatened by your intelligence, your hard work, so I belittled you to feel stronger." I remained silent, and she continued, "And that day when you suggested investing in cryptocurrency, I knew it was a good idea, that's why I rejected it so decisively. I was afraid Dad would see you were smarter than me. I'd read about Bitcoin, I understood the potential, but I couldn't let you be right, and yes, I insisted on your firing." I exhaled. "So you knew?" She nodded, "Yes, and I regret it every day since, but not because you succeeded, although that made me realize how stupid I was. I regret it because I lost my sister." I stirred my coffee, at a loss for words, and Gina continued, "I'm not asking you to forgive me right now, I just want you to know, I'm sorry, I'm truly sorry, and if you ever want to talk to me again, even just as acquaintances, I'd be happy to." I finally looked up and said, "I need time." She nodded, "I understand." We finished our coffee almost in silence, but it wasn't the icy silence that had separated us before, but rather a tenuous truce, shaky but real. Over the next year, we began to communicate little by little, short messages at first, then occasional calls. She told me about her work, about her husband's struggle with addiction and how he'd been sober for over 2 years, about her small victories. I shared with her about my business, about the new artificial intelligence startups I'd invested in. It would never be the sisterly relationship we'd had as children. Too much had been destroyed, too much pain had been left behind, but it was still something. My parents continued to successfully manage their investments, they adapted to a simpler lifestyle, and, strangely enough, they began to seem happier. My father once, during a rare visit to my office, said words I never expected to hear: "You saved me. I know you didn't mean to, but that's exactly what you did. You lifted a burden off my shoulders and made the company successful again." As for me, my company continued to grow. We invested in the technologies of the future, backed entrepreneurs no one else believed in, and yes, we sometimes failed, but more often, we achieved stunning success. I proved everyone who doubted me wrong. I built something bigger and better than my family's company ever was. I got my revenge in the most convincing way possible, through my success, surpassing their wildest dreams. But over time, I realized that revenge no longer mattered to me. What mattered was that I had built a life I was proud of. On my own terms. My family and I will never be close the way other families are. Too much had been broken, too much had been hurt, to go back. But we found a way to coexist, to build an honest, if not entirely warm, relationship. Gina would sometimes disappear for months without contact, but when she called or wrote, it was sincere, without pretense, without manipulation, just a real conversation, and you know what? That was enough. I no longer needed my family's approval. I didn't need them to admit I was right, even though they eventually did.